Please note this presentation is being recorded. For those of you not within Australia, it is a sign of respect to acknowledge our traditional custodians. Accordingly, on behalf of CASA, I respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which our offices are located and the places to which we travel for work. We also pay our respects to the elders, past and present, and as well as those who are emerging. I'd like to welcome you to the CASA team developing the Vertiport regulatory framework. As mentioned, my name is Joe Hayne, and I am currently the team leader for Future Aerodromes. Dan Parsons is the Senior Standards Officer for Aerodromes and Heliports. Dan's portfolio now includes vertiports. Liam Smith is the Vertiport Specialist. Liam has been focused on this new aviation sector for several years. Collectively, the team has 54 years of aviation experience, with 30 years in aerodrome operations and airfield management, and 24 years as aviation safety regulators, both nationally and internationally. The CASA Remotely Piloted Aircraft Systems, or RPAS, and Advanced Air Mobility, or AAM, Strategic Regulatory Roadmap, or the RPAS and AAM Roadmap, and the Australian National Emerging Aviation Technologies Policy Statement, or the NEAT, foreshadowed the need to introduce requirements for specialised aerodromes to facilitate the introduction and expansion of advanced air mobility aircraft into the Australian aviation ecosystem. The draft guidelines for vertiport design were developed to fulfil some of those needs. The initial guidelines to vertiport design have been developed to assist those intending to introduce specialised types of aerodromes, being vertiports. Vertical takeoff and landing capable aircraft, or VCA, are defined as heavier than air aircraft, other than aeroplanes and helicopters, capable of performing vertical procedures by means of more than 2 lift or thrust units. VCA may be able to use existing infrastructure such as aerodromes or helicopter landing sites and newly created AAM-specific vertiports. As per the Australian Civil Aviation Act 1988, by definition, vertiports will be aerodromes that cater specifically for VCA. However, in some cases, the vertiport may cater for other aircraft types such as helicopters, with future considerations to include short takeoff landing and short takeoff vertical landing aircraft. Vertiports are expected to have a varying level of complexity, and it is not expected that a one-shoe-fits-all approach can be applied to this emerging sector. Despite the apparent similarities between helicopters and some AAM aircraft, there already appears to be a divergence in operational procedures and performance characteristics that can't be accommodated by existing standards. As AAM matures as a sector and data becomes available, heliport and vertiport standards may converge. But for now, these draft vertiport specifications have been designed with flexibility in mind. In the early years after AAM aircraft are introduced, there is likely to be few differences between vertiports and heliports. The helicopter industry is mature, with decades of operating experience, knowledge and understanding. Currently, there is little operational experience with AAM aircraft, and most current knowledge of AAM aircraft performance is from testing of aircraft in preparation for initial certification by aviation safety regulators. How aircraft operators intend to use their aircraft in the variety of operating environments and conditions remains unclear. There is an expectation that some sites will support combined or concurrent helicopter and AAM operations. Where those concurrent operations occur, the most restrictive of each aircraft types will need to be considered by the vertiport operator. It is expected that due to reasons outside the remit of this current discussion, VCA will be able to operate a vertiport where outside CASA's remit, helicopter operations are not otherwise permitted to operate. Significantly, in many cases, aerodromes and HLS are not generally located nearby to where people want to travel to and from. In some cases, the aerodrome will be the destination for the AAM journey. Outside the range of aviation safety standards, there may be significant resistance to the introduction of heliports in locations where, AAM aircraft are intended to operate into the future. Along with aviation safety legislation and guidelines, other factors may need to be considered by the vertiport operator during their design, construction, and operating phases. The NASA Aeronautics Research Institute, or NARI, has identified over 400 issues that may need to be considered by vertiport operators for those in the United States. These considerations may be similar in Australia. For instance, land use planning provisions may change from state to state or territory and from council to council or shire to shire. The planning provision for each location will need to be considered based on the land use planning provisions of each intended vertiport site. The manner in which VCA may interact with airspace and other operating aircraft may also need to be considered. Considerations may include the density of aircraft and volume of airspace arriving to and departing from nearby aerodromes, helicopter landing sites, and other vertiports. Under the RPAS and AAM roadmap, airspace and traffic management is one of the 6 regulatory areas that will require work to facilitate autonomous AAM aircraft operations into the future. A vertiport operator may need to consider security based on aviation security requirements or state and territory policing requirements. This is a list of this is example list only. It should not be considered as exhaustive of the items to be considered by each vertiport operator. At the time of developing the draft guidelines for vertiport design, there were no actual AAM aircraft operations performing air transport operations in Australia. However, some AAM aircraft were being tested with some aircraft at various stages of their certification program. It is expected AAM VTOL capable aircraft will be arriving in Australia in the coming years. The draft AC guidelines for vertiport design is a starting point for how Australia facilities are intended to support VCA in Australia and how those vertiports should be designed. The initial draft AC is not intended to outline the operational maintenance requirements for each vertiport. Operation and maintenance guidelines for vertiports will be subject to other advisory circulars, which are under development. CASA fully expects that the AC or vertiport design, once finalised, will be subject to change as AAM aircraft start operating, vertiport operators gain experience, and when international experience with AAM aircraft becomes available. This conversation will include an overview of the draft AC, how the draft AC was developed, where information within the draft AC was sourced, CASA's proposed guidelines on physical characteristics, obstacles and visual aids, and the consultation process. If you have any questions, please add them in the chat. And if there is time, we'll endeavour to answer those questions. And the chat is now open. In the early years after the introduction of AAM aircraft, a framework to codify these aircraft, like codes for existing fixed and rotary wing aircraft, is unlikely to exist. The way the OEM envisaged their aircraft may operate and the way aircraft operators to choose their aircraft may vary. Variations may include power consumption reduction, range optimization, noise reduction, destination and turnaround times, and cost reduction programs. CASA soon recognised a new way of thinking was required to enable this new sector to emerge at a scale, at a cost, and at desired complexity for day one of the vertiport operator's intended operating plan. Hence, a building block approach was introduced. Depending on where the vertiport is intended to be located and the nature of aircraft operations intended to be supported by the vertiport operator, will result in vertiports being simplistic or complex. CASA's approach to developing the initial guidelines for vertiport design focused on an outcome-based approach. This is to ensure that the flexibility and innovation is possible when designing individual vertiports. Not all factors impacting the vertiport will be based on aviation safety. Hence, other regulatory environments may need to be considered as building blocks. In 2022, a project was commissioned to develop the CASA concept for vertiport infrastructure in line with the RPAS and AAM roadmap. The project commenced with a review of existing standards for aeroplanes, helicopter landing sites, aerodromes, and determined there was sufficient long-term need to develop initial guidance for vertiport operators. Aligned with the RPAS and AAM roadmap, vertiport operations are likely to increase in complexity during the different time horizons, until a time when autonomous aircraft will operate to and from vertiports. As the project progressed, some wonderful work from overseas became accessible. The work included outcomes of research by Dr. Nancy Mendoza and the team from the NASA Aeronautical Research Institute, or NARI, the European Union Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, and their prototype specifications for the design of vertiports, VFR vertiports, for operations with manned VTOL capable aircraft in the enhanced category, or the PTS. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, engineering briefs, or EBs, for vertiport design. These documents were pivotal in developing Australia's draft guidelines for vertiport design. Along with the PTS and EB, other documents such as the ASTM International's new specification for vertiports were considered. These documents provided information that was key to the developing of this draft AC. Initially, vertiports will likely support VTOL capable aircraft being operated by a pilot in visual conditions, but as the industry matures, the move will likely be to automated aircraft in all weather conditions. The draft guidelines for vertiport design's building block principle demonstrates the same building block may be used at a different facility, but may look different or provide a different outcome. Although various considerations may seem the same and may be based on similar principles, each consideration will be unique to the vertiport and the range of aircraft that will use that facility. The outcome-based framework will see the vertiport operator determine the parameters they intended for each element of their facility based on their initial and ongoing operational plan. Input will be required from OEMs, AFM, Aircraft Flight Manual, and the operational plan of each aircraft operator to ensure alignment. The configuration of vertiports may look similar, but are intended to support different aircraft types, or configuration of various vertiports may look vastly different, but may support the same range of aircraft types and their operating needs. Accordingly, it is unlikely two vertiports will be the same. By now, many of you would have read the draft AC and considered its contents. For those that may not have read the document, the 5 sections within the AC are: reference materials, introduction, physical characteristics, obstacle limitation surfaces, visual aids including markings, markers, and lighting. Due to the lack of data available, CASA chose to stay with outcome-based principles due to the wide range of issues to be managed by vertiport operators and their individual facility needs. Specifically, vertiport operators may need to consider operational needs of each aircraft operator they may have a relationship with. This webinar is the first in a series of webinars designed to provide greater insight to the development of the draft AC. Feedback you have on the AC should be submitted through the CASA Consultation Hub. More to come on that shortly. I now hand over to Liam to talk about what will be discussed in webinar 2.
Thanks, Joe. During the second webinar, we'll be focusing on section 3 of the AC, so physical characteristics of vertiports. We'll review the important defining terms that are the building blocks for determining facility dimensions and how they interrelate. In webinar 2, we'll expand on the building block concept that Joe just covered as the essential elements of a vertiport and the optional ones. Starting from FATOs and TLOF, we'll cover how and why we've described those elements in the AC the way we have. Optional vertiport elements, such as taxiways, stands, stand protection areas, will be reviewed as well. If we have sufficient time, we'll also endeavour to discuss some of the feedback that we've received through the Consultation Hub. Now over to Dan.
Thank you very much, Liam. In the third webinar, and this will be in around mid-January, the start of February, We'll be looking at the obstacle limitation surface standards or specifications that we've put together. Now, as much as Joe's described the unknown variables associated with VCA operations, we've taken a very similar approach, and again, the building block approach to obstacle limitation surfaces. Since we can already see in these test beds that exist quite some complex flight path arrangements and alternatives, and we need to be ready to accommodate that. At the moment, you would note, if you've read the AC, that the obstacle limitation surfaces are merely specifications for their layout and design. We have a lot more work to do in understanding the nature of obstacle control in this environment and what sort of operational processes will exist and how we will interact, or how vertiport operators will interact with their stakeholders. At this stage, the goal is to provide a framework for how people can understand the assessment of obstacles in the vicinity of vertiports, and that is especially important for vertiport proponents that are looking to develop sites within what we know as obstacle-rich environments. For webinar 4, we'll be looking at visual aids, and this will actually be quite a longer webinar since we'll be covering indicators, markers, markings and lights. Again, we've taken, a flexible approach and a building block approach to these design parameters as well. I'll hand back to Joe.
Thank you, Dan and Liam. As the AAM sector and its ecosystems are emerging, change is inevitable. However, the impact of that change needs to be considered. As actual VCA performance data becomes available, there is a potential for changes in CASA's guidance. Additionally, ICAO standards and recommended practices and feedback from other national aviation authorities may influence the future versions of the finalised AC. The initial guidance for vertiport design is provided as a starting point for the industry to consider and provide feedback. Feedback will be considered prior to the finalisation of the advisory circular in 2023. Future changes to the guidance material may be considered as OEM provide performance data for their aircraft and the aircraft flight manuals become available. Once information and data of actual flight and the aircraft operator experience how their aircraft operate in their operating environments, and the move towards non-crewed autonomous aircraft operations, and what changes vertiport operators and vertiport designers may need to consider to support automated flight. CASA is seeking your thoughts and views on the draft guidelines for vertiport design. Any feedback should be provided through the CASA Consultation Hub, as will be used in that feedback to strengthen the AC prior to finalisation and potentially use information in future iterations of the AC. As CASA is a member of the ICAO Vertiport Design Sub-Working Group, the Australian conversation can be included in ICAO's international discussions about vertiports. Feedback through the consultation will be provided to the Aviation Safety Advisory Panel, or ASAP. CASA will be seeking a technical working group to be stood up by ASAP to further develop a regulatory framework for infrastructure to support AAM aircraft into the future. The intent is for the technical working group to provide support and guidance on the future of the regulatory framework for vertiports. CASA is also inviting those interested to nominate to participate in future ASAP working technical groups to register. Please submit your nominations through the CASA Consultation Hub if you would like to participate in future technical working groups. In conclusion, CASA is providing draft AC 139 Victor 01 guidelines for vertiport design for your consideration and feedback. The draft AC provides an opportunity for potential vertiport operators, designers, aircraft operators to assist develop foundational guidelines for vertiport design in Australia. Please keep in mind that as the AAM sector is emerging, change is likely. The impact of any change will be considered with any potential impact to aviation safety. The Consultation Hub will remain open until the 31st of March 2023 to give time for people to consider the information allow time to model various options available to potential vertiport operators, and allow OEMs and future AAM aircraft operators time to analyse the outcome-based framework. Please provide any feedback you may have through the Consultation Hub. Also, please remember, CASA is inviting those interested to participate in future ASAP technical working groups. On behalf of the CASA team, thank you for participating in this webinar, and we look forward to maturing the draft advisory circular with your support and feedback in 2023. That concludes the webinar. And if there's any questions, Dan, I'd like to throw back to you and see if you want to answer those questions if there are any on the chat.
Thank you very much, Joe. I've answered the couple of questions that we've already had, but I'm more than happy to stay on a little bit longer if there are some questions. And I can see Mohammed, thank you for your question. Yes, anybody can participate in the Consultation Hub. It's an online form that you can complete. There are certain parameters there in terms of your acceptance of publishing your details. We can keep everything confidential if that's what you request. But in fact, we encourage any of our overseas colleagues who have an interest in this space to provide feedback, especially from learnings from overseas. We're interested in all information that we can get at this stage. Just responding to Gareth's question there, thank you. In terms of noise, no, CASA does not regulate noise generally, and in this case, nor do we do it for AAM. Thank you for the question, Yusuf. We don't have any particular visibility of time frame for the introduction of AAM. Our primary motivation for this particular team at the moment is to have specifications ready and available for vertiport proponents to facilitate the introduction after those aircraft become certified and those operations meet the requirements that will exist for them. And Phil, thank you for your question. At this stage, we're waiting for more information on what instrument flight or non-visual flight will look like in the AAM space to understand better how to support that through the vertiport structure. So just in case you missed it, the scope of this advisory circular is for vertical capable aircraft or VTOL capable aircraft operating in visual conditions with a pilot on board. I can see Reese's question there with respect. The immediate plan beyond this AC are for additional ACs to cover vertiport operations and maintenance. The larger picture there is going to be guided by the twig, the ASAP twig that Joe provided details on. We're looking forward to having many stakeholders engaged in that process and essentially help us build a larger regulatory framework. So that is very much an open question that we're looking for feedback from industry on. With respect to Gary's question regarding a particular composite eVTOL, no. So Liam will get into this a lot more in the next webinar with respect to the concept of Design D and the design aircraft. It is very flexible to the particular operations that a vertiport operator intends to support, but I won't spoil the fun for the next webinar. I can see Richard shared some details for Transport New South Wales, so I'll leave that for people to pick up on. Mohammed's question regarding a prototype vertiport. There are plans afoot from a number of vertiport operators or proponents, but at this stage we don't have a physical vertiport facility specifically to these standards since they are so new. As mentioned, this is in response to Rex, as mentioned by Joe, we have referenced international standards and material, the EASA prototype standards and the FAA engineering brief in particular. In terms of harmonisation, I'll let you know that Joe here is our intended representative on ICAO's Vertiport design subgroup, and it'll be through that avenue that we will look at harmonisation and assisting essentially the development of international standards in this space. In response to Brian, anybody with an interest is probably our first port of call with respect to TWIG members. Obviously, we are also keen to get those with insight into the AAM development space, and of course, people with an interest in vertiport development generally. But the more the merrier, to be honest, to bring a diversity of input into this space, especially given it's so new. Thanks, Brian. With respect to Abdul Ghani's question or point almost about IFR considerations, again, we'll take any feedback. If you have some insight into potential non-visual flying in this space, we will take it on. It's a fast-moving area, so we won't delay taking those considerations. It may not be incorporated into the first full edition of the AC, but it will definitely be part of our ongoing continuous improvement in this space. This AC is going to be, we think, quite a living document and responsive to the industry. A same response really to GC's question with respect to the pilot on board aspect. Again, any data or information that we can gather at this stage to understand what the implications of that will be from a vertiport design point of view, we will take on board and either factor into early revisions, if not the first revision. But to help us keep focus on a particular scope, we did establish it at the VTOL capable aircraft with a pilot on board in visual conditions. But again, we'll take any information we can get from the industry. With respect to Jason, and I'll look a little bit to my colleagues who are sometimes more keyed into the land use planning, I'm not aware of any particular jurisdictions that have any complicated land use planning side of things. Joe, did you want to jump in on perhaps some of the US aspects? They have a completely different aviation regulatory framework to us, but is there anything that you think might you could add for Jason there?
Yes, there are conversations going with other regulators, the department and land use planning authorities around the country. Obviously, each state and territory have their own land use planning provisions, and they also use the NASAF guidelines, the National Airport Safeguarding Framework guidelines, which have been adopted in most states and/or territories around the country. We're waiting to hear back feedback from other agencies about where they're going with that conversation, and obviously those agencies will be announcing, and I'm sure in the not too distant future, how they're going to deal with those states, territories, and from a national perspective. Without putting any more words in those other agencies' mouths, that's about as far as I can go.
Thank you very much, Joe. Moving on to the next question for Reese again. In terms of alignment with the US and the EASA standards in particular, we definitely have them front of mind when we were preparing these. We essentially went through step by step, and in addition to Annex 14 Volume 2, and made specific decisions with respect, not so much aligning with both, but often having to make a choice about which one we would align to. We've made some decisions, and those that are familiar with those standards when reading our AC will be able to identify that. Probably the biggest aspect of our approach here, though, has been, as Joe described, pulling together an outcome-based set of specifications, something that is simple yet scalable, and then ultimately flexible to the industry. So we've probably made far less prescriptive determinations with respect to that, but overall we have sought to align as much as possible. I'm not sure, GC has repeated the question. At this stage, the scope is for pilot on board operations, AAM operations, we're mindful of potentially autonomous, semi or highly autonomous operations in the future. We have a little nod to that in our standards for visual aids with respect to machine readable visual aids. But at this stage, it is somewhat focused on the pilot on board operation. In response to Michael's question regarding Air Services Australia, at the moment, this AC is focused on the physical ground-based infrastructure for the movement of the AAM. And the airspace picture is part of a much larger AAM ecosystem that needs to have a all-of-government approach. And we have colleagues in the department and even within CASA that are building these capabilities and will bring together the stakeholders. From our point of view, part of what has motivated us to get out in front of this is the time taken for infrastructure to be developed. So we wanted to have at least some specifications in place to assist vertiport proponents in starting to make some of those earlier decisions. But there's very much a lot more work happening to build the overall ecosystem. Beatty, your question regarding definitions, we have as much as possible tried to align. And again, going back to Reese's question with respect to the FAA and EASA, if you're familiar with their draft documents initially and now their fully published documents, there have been some nuances in common terminology, such as D. We have taken more what appears to be the, let's say, the trend with respect to the EASA approach in terms of the overall determination of D. It aligns more with ICAO, but is a little bit different to the historical approach in Australia with respect to traditional rotorcraft. So there will be some variation, and going back to one of the early slides that Joe mentioned, why not use heliport standards? There is this physical variation between the aircraft, potential operational variation, and at this stage, we are treating them somewhat different, although there could be some convergence later on where those two concepts and theories come back together. So we're sort of playing the middle ground with respect to some of the terms that we're using that have a certain familiarity, but at this stage we are being somewhat focused on vertiports and AAM just to permit that flexibility in this relatively new space. Michael, I think we'll take that question regarding TWIG membership on notice. The Stakeholder Engagement Division will be working through those applications, and you'll note that that expression of interest system is more general than just the vertiport space. So I'll ask our colleague in the SED division here just to take your details down and get back to you directly with respect to the process of responding to the EOIs for the TWIG. But thank you for bringing it up.
Dan, just for clarity, the next ASAP meeting will be in late January, so it's not likely to hear much back before that time.
Okay. And I think I did see from the last screen that the closing date on the current expression of interest is the 1st of February as well. But we will get back to you, Michael, with the timeline specific to the vertiport TWIG. Vova, just with respect to your question, at this stage, being an advisory circular, this is guidance material within the Australian space. So in terms of requirements for vertiport facilities, that would be an expectation essentially established by the aircraft operator. It's very much part of the scope of work of the TWIG that we will be pulling together in the new year to help us develop any sort of regulatory framework around these type of specifications and what the future requirements will be. So we very much want to be developing that in concert with our stakeholders in the new year. Thank you for sharing, Rick. I think that's in response to the New South Wales policy work. Michael, the question regarding simplifying things with respect to eVTOLs, I can't really comment on that. It is a complex space, and different parts of the industry are likely to require different regulatory approaches. So I'll leave each of those areas to make those decisions again in accordance with CASA's overall regulatory development philosophy and policies. So at this stage, it's very much the approach we're taking for the vertiport space, but other aspects like operations and aircraft certification may need to make different decisions with respect to their overall policy. So I will leave it for them to share as those become more mature. Thank you, Reese. Hi, Clem. I can't really comment on investment and attracting investment and policies like that. I'll have to leave that to other aspects of the government to do so. But I think, as I reflected earlier, we are mindful of having a set of specifications available to the vertiport proponent industry to help them develop their plans and any infrastructure that they need to be looking to support AAM in the future. Eric, with respect to your question, again, that looks to be a much bigger piece of policy associated with fostering the industry generally. And I think we've already seen a couple of other comments from our colleagues in state governments, and those that are familiar will know of other state government policies that are out there looking to develop the industry as a whole. With respect to this advisory circular, its scope is very much limited to the vertiport space, the physical infrastructure space that supports the wider AAM industry. So in terms of this body very much is Joe, Liam and I as a dedicated vertiport team within CASA to work on these particular specifications. We are very keen and have already been putting out our fingers into the other areas to make sure that we interface well with the larger community, both the government community and the industry. Obviously, the industry piece is the twig that we would love to get people engaged in and involved in. And of course, the consultation that we currently have out, definitely love to get the feedback. There will be more announcements by other government departments. We are privy to some of them. And we are basically knocking on any door when somebody wants to talk about vertiports and AAM as well. So I would encourage everybody to keep an eye on not just CASA's social media, but also the department, the Federal Department of Transport, and the associated state governments as well. Yusuf, the question regarding airspace is a great question. And again, I'm going to pull the answer that we've got a limited scope within respect of this particular AC and this particular team. As mentioned before, in response to the air services question, there are a lot of people interested in building the wider infrastructure. If you are a person that is familiar with airspace and especially the growing concept of UTM, CASA actually has a position available at the moment for a standards officer in UTM. And if you're in that space, or if you know people in that space, we'd encourage you to apply to help build up our own knowledge in this space. We definitely want to grab as much input as possible. So there is that position available if you're working in that space at the moment. Rex, with respect to fire safety standards, this is a great question, an absolutely great question, and a very thorny question. It's something we definitely want to tackle in consultation with other stakeholders, particularly building code, local firefighting organisations, planning, land planning authorities, anybody that has an interest in this particular issue. We want to do that in consultation with those groups. So at this stage, yes, you will notice that we have not included ARFF standards in this advisory circular, and that's very much because the type of space that vertiports may occupy within our urban environments in particular and other built environments is a lot more complex than perhaps the historical segregation of aerodromes. So it's very much on our to-do list, but definitely under the consultative approach. Richard, that's a fair enough comment with respect to alignment in the broader global market, especially given that there are currently no operating AAM in Australia. We do have, I believe, at least one aircraft that's looking to be developed within Australia and a few looking to test here. But global alignment will be something that we're looking to achieve. And as I mentioned earlier, Joe will be our representative on ICAO's dedicated subgroup that's looking to develop the global standards generally. Thank you, Reese, for sharing the link to the federal government's policy on drones. Concept of operations, Richard, not that we've necessarily referenced with respect to the development of these vertiport standards. We have seen some concept of operations typically by particular vendors and proponents of AAM. Honestly, they are at the much higher maturity level of AAM and not something we could necessarily leverage for the first iteration of this advisory circular, but we too are keeping an eye on the development of those ConOps and to see how the industry may actually deploy AAM in the future. Okay, I'm not sure how I caught up to those questions. They were coming through thick and fast. We still have a little bit of time in the scheduled webinar if there are any more questions to come through. But it looks a bit quiet and I don't think you really want to sit there looking at me. So I'll hand back to Joe to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you for everybody for your participation today, and thank you for those questions, and thank you, Dan, for providing those answers. We will be working hard, not just with the technical working group, but with other agencies, with other stakeholders, land use planning departments, providing advice about aviation safety and listening to how they intend to allow this emerging industry to become part of the Australian aviation ecosystem. With that, I bid you adieu. Have a nice day, and thank you for your participation.